topic of my teaching is the Sign of Jonah and something greater. Something greater is a really important key phrase in this passage Rabbi read this morning. It seems to be at a kind of a crescendo of that moment. What is this something greater? I'm going to start by asking a couple of questions. So Matthew 12 is this passage that Rabbi read this morning as we were just getting ready and entering worship. The scribes and the Pharisees asked Yeshua for a sign. And in the story, he refused to give them the sign, and he calls them an evil and adulterous generation. Now, that's not very nice words, right? I mean, if you came to me and you said, hey, well, can I ask you a question? I said, get away from me, you evil adulterous generation. That would not be something you would be happy about. So definitely not something nice. Whatever that means, we can dig into that and think out loud in a minute. But the question is why? What was so evil about the request? They were just asking for a sign. So let's look a little closer at this passage and see what we have going on here. So just so that it's fresh in our mind, because this is the key passage in this chapter. It says, when some of the scribes and the Pharisees came to him, so probably not all of them, but some of them who were there, they said, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. But he answered them, an evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so for 3 days and 3 nights the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth. The people of Nineveh will rise up in all the judgment with the generation and condemn it, because they repented at the proclamation of Jonah. And see, something greater than Jonah is here. What I want to draw your attention to is this language. Besides the fact that he kind of brushes him off with this rude remark, right? He says, no sign will be given to you except the sign of Jonah. So traditionally, there's an explanation about the sign of Jonah. What is this? So only the sign of Jonah. Just as Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days, so will the Son of Man be in the heart of the earth for 3 days. So what is this mysterious sign of Jonah? Should it not be obvious to us what it is? So the most popular view of all the gospel interpreters is that the sign of Jonah is Messiah and his own resurrection. Didn't he just say that? The whole Jonah allusion? 3 days, 3 nights. Isn't that the sign of Jonah? Isn't that what happened to Jonah will now happen to Yeshua? That's the sign you're going to get. So don't ask me for any more signs. That's what you're going to get, and that's what you have to live with. If you look a little bit closer, you will notice that he actually did not explain himself very plainly. Some people say, oh, there it is, it's plain, but I actually think he did not. And I can show you why it's not so plain and simple, and why this popular interpretation, sort of say the common way of reading that text, may not be exactly what it says. So there's some other options that I want us to consider. So here's the first couple of things. Now, why would Nineveh judge this evil and adulterous generation? I want you to think for a second about Nineveh, okay? These are pagans. Why would pagans judge Israelites? And what point, in the prophetic history is this even possible? And from what perspective of the Torah this is even feasible? Nineveh repented, good, but their repentance was really short-lived and actually went right back to their sinful ways. And so, we realize we're not talking about the actual judgment. It's not like Nineveh is a testament to holiness. I mean, you can read the prophets, Prophet Nahum, the whole entire book is about judgment of Nineveh, the destruction, the obliteration of Nineveh, and other prophets as well. So it's not like Nineveh is this paragon of righteousness we're talking about. So that's kind of strange. So if the sign of Jonah means a resurrection after 3 days in the grave, then there's another point that I wanted to show you. And this is where I read Matthew 16, and it makes absolutely no sense. If Jonah, sign of Jonah, equals resurrection, then we're going to have to explain this text because it says something very, very similar. So look with me at Matthew 16. Right there from the beginning, it says, the Pharisees and Sadducees came to test Jesus, and they asked him to show them a sign from heaven. He answered them, When is it evening, you say, it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And the morning, it will be a stormy day, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. An evil and adulterous generation asks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. Then he left them and went away. So once again, we have a very similar story, very similar scenario. It's like identical. The setting is almost identical, right? Very similar. Pharisees come, they ask Yeshua for a sign. He says no. He calls them an evil and adulterous generation, but then he adds a little caveat, right? So he does tell them he will show them the sign of Jonah. That's all they're going to get. But then, ironically, he remarks how they can interpret the color of the sky. They can predict the weather without reservations. They have such a system figured out of how they can just look at the sky and figure out what's going to happen the next day. I mean, they have the whole weather forecasting down. But they fail to recognize the times they live in. That is the only criticism that he actually gives them that's concrete, besides the fact that you're an evil and adulterous generation, right? So the situation is almost similar. The problem is, does Matthew 16 passage, which is very similar to Matthew 12 that we just read, point to the sign of Jonah being Messiah's resurrection? There's nothing in this passage that seems to want us to see Jonah and any of his ordeal. We don't see the context for resurrection here, so which makes me wonder that the whole resurrection symbol is maybe just a rushed conclusion. Maybe we misread what the sign of Jonah really means by simply saying, oh, that looks good, it's right there in the text. You know, it's a good rule to allow the text to explain the text, but then you have to look at other texts beyond that text. And so I got almost identical story, identical words, without any mention of what this sign really is here. So it makes me ask a question. Could we have missed something and jumped the gun? And basically that's the question I wanted to answer in this teaching. What is another possibility, or maybe other possibilities, for this sign of Jonah? And how would it fit? Because if I have to say definitively that the sign of Jonah is resurrection, then this passage makes no sense. I'm offering you this little journey to just travel through and see what are other possibilities that are out there. So in Matthew 12, in verse 41, Yeshua concludes his remark by stating that something greater than Jonah is here. So you have the sign of Jonah, right? But then you have this statement that something even greater than Jonah is here. And that is his emphasis. It seems to be like a crescendo, okay? And of course, the popular view, the status quo opinion, once again, that this something greater is Messiah himself. Well, what else could it be? Didn't he just say so? Son of Man, 3 days, 3 nights, you know, it's right there. So it makes sense that most people think that the sign of Jonah is resurrection. What else can it be? So the reference to the sign of Jonah and this something greater terminology comes up also more than once. You start looking for these signs, you start following the trail, and you say, wait a minute, is there anywhere else that he says these similar things? Yes, the something greater part also comes out in Matthew 12, not just in verse 41, but also in 12:6, in the very, very beginning of that chapter. And that makes me think that maybe we have missed a lot more context that might help us clarify this question. And that we have excluded context. Whenever you interpret things, you always look at it in context. We have excluded the context of the entire 12th chapter of Matthew. If we want to understand what is this something greater than the sign of Jonah, and we have to understand the sign of Jonah, then let's begin from the beginning where this phrase first pops up, and then see if we can follow the logic. So I've already showed you that the resurrection interpretation of the sign of Jonah does not always fit, doesn't fit into Matthew 16. There's no mention of Jonah there. Now, what I propose is that sign of Jonah really means something else, but we have to walk through the entire chapter 12. And that might take us a while. And that's why I have multiple sessions with you, because there's no way I could do an entire chapter in 1 hour. So Something greater, and the Lord of the Sabbath. How many of you have read this passage before? I mean, this is the crown passage of Matthew 12. I mean, everybody loves this. The Lord of the Sabbath teaching has been taught and retaught and preached from every possible angle. I've heard multiple angles on it. So what in the world am I going to tell you that's going to be any different at all? I don't know. It is one of my beloved passages. So if I start getting too deep into it, I'm sorry. Matthew 12, verses 1 and 2. There's an accusation that happens here. We read, "At the time, Yeshua went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, 'Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath.'" So here's some questions that immediately pop up. First of all, harvesting is prohibited on the Sabbath. We know that. That's in the Torah, okay? Exodus 34. We're told, do not do this. No questions. Nobody would ever doubt this particular text. We know furthermore that harvesting is one of the 39 traditional melachot. The teachings of the sages say that there's 39 different types of labors or activities that we are prohibited to participate in on Shabbat. And all of them, of course, are derived from the Torah. And it's very clearly this. Why? Because the Torah actually doesn't tell us everything. There are some things that Torah tells us flat out, do not do on Shabbat, like do not, for example, harvest, or do not light a fire. So there are some things that are stated point blank, clear, no questions. Others, God doesn't always go into details. What does it mean to keep Sabbath holy? What does it mean to sanctify it? How do we do it? What things we do? I mean, where's the line that we do not cross? So the rabbis took the time to create 39 different categories of work and the things that you're not supposed to do. And harvesting is clearly one of them. So you kind of have the tradition and you have the Torah, both point to the direction you're not supposed to do that. So the question that I'm asking is plucking grain, rubbing it between your hands, basically dehusking it, and then popping it into your mouth, is that considered harvesting? Some people would say yes. Some people would say no. Obviously, the people in this passage who are accusing the disciples would say yes, that's harvesting. So is that harvesting or is it not? We have a difference of opinion going on here. And we're talking about the Torah's commandment, and we're talking about our interpretation of it. What constitutes harvesting? But I did want to bring up a little bit something for you. This is a conversation in the Talmud. This is Babylonian Talmud Beitzah 13b. And the rabbis are discussing the very issue of halacha, the very issue of law that pertains to plucking grain, eating it. Is it harvesting or not? That is exactly the question they're answering. So they say, we have learned elsewhere, he who hulls barley may hull it grain by grain and eat it. But if he hulls it and lays the grains in his hand, he's liable to give the tithe. Now, this is very important in Torah. If the produce is considered to be a harvested produce, you have to give tithe because all produce has to be tithed. Specifically, actually, the Torah doesn't talk about tithing money, it actually talks about tithing produce. So this is a very important issue. If the harvest happened, then the tithe legally must happen. So they continue. Rabbi Eliezer said, it is likewise with respect to the Sabbath. So if he does this on the Sabbath, he picks up some grain, holds it, he's got to give tithes even on the Sabbath. Well, not really, you can't give it by the Sabbath, but it applies to the Sabbath too. He says, but this is not so. For Rab's wife hauled him cupfuls, and likewise Rav Chia's wife hauled cupfuls for him. Rather, if this statement, the statement of Rabbi Eliezer, has been said, it has said with respect to the second clause, he who rubs ears of wheat may winnow them with one hand and to the other and eat them without tithing. But if he winnows them and lays them in his lap, he is liable. Said Rabbi Eliezer, and likewise is with respect to the Sabbath. So the rabbis are discussing, basically, First of all, tithe. There's multiple issues here. Tithe is the first one, Sabbath is the second one. But Sabbath, they just tack on. So if you harvested enough grain to constitute a harvest, then you must tithe it. And as Rabbi is discussing this issue, which is actually, his original statement is in the Mishnah, they explain that it's permissible to take a handful of grain and rub it, hull it, okay, take it off its husks and eat it, as long as you're not gathering it into some sort of an organized fashion. If you just picked it and eat it, it's not a problem. If you picked it and set it aside, like put it in your hand and hold it, or put it in your lap and gather it, and now you actually have a significant gathering of grain, now that amount is liable to tithe. But if you just picked it and ate it immediately, just satisfied your need, then that's not tithable, and therefore, in respect to the Sabbath, it doesn't count as a significant enough amount to break it. Anyway, so this is Talmud, this is Beitzah. I wanted to show you that. It's actually based on another passage in the Mishnah. This is the core passage. It's very similar. The same discussion, it's just the rabbis are talking around that one, and there's a lot more detail because they bring the idea of the Sabbath, which the original Mishnah passage does not. But I wanted you to know, if you're curious, you can look it up in Mishnah Masrot 4.5. That's the original, that's what they're discussing in Beitzah. So follow the trails. You know, I always give you my sources so you can later check it out and look it out yourself, okay? So, the whole idea of chasking, you know, and eating and rubbing it with your hands, are you really harvesting? Are you really processing food? Or is this amount really not significant enough because you're just rubbed it, put it in your mouth and ate it and that's it? You're not really storing up. And if it's not legal to tithe that amount, then certainly that amount is negligible and it's not considered true harvesting. That's what the rabbis came to me. So Yeshua gives us a defense. And this is his defense. There's a lot more. He doesn't go into all the legal issues, because remember, the Talmud I'm bringing in, that's a legal discussion. He doesn't take that route. He actually goes a different way, although he follows down a very legal form of discourse. So he said to them, have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which was not lawful for him or his companions to eat, but only for the priests. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath, and yet they're guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. Okay, there comes that phrase. Something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. So again, familiar passage. Hopefully you've read this before, you've heard this before, and you've heard a few explanations before here. So let's just look at the basics. The basics is he's going to cite the case of David. Then he's going to say the priests actually violate Shabbat by performing the very type of labors that are prohibited in the list of the 39 melachot. The things that they have to do in the temple in order to make the sacrifices happen, an average Israelite is not allowed to do. And yet they're somehow guiltless. The Torah is not holding them accountable to them. It says, but there's something greater than the temple here, and you don't get it because you don't understand this verse from Hosea. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, which is a really big slap, because you have to understand, Pharisees, Roshim, this is like inscribed on their flag. Okay, if Pharisees had a flag, if they had a crest, okay, that would have been right there. Okay, this is their motto. That's their favorite verse. And he tells them, if you only understood what that means, you would not have gone this path and basically accuse my disciples of breaking the Torah. And then he makes this mysterious statements that the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. What does it all mean? How does it all break out? I want to show you just the main points that he makes. So let's be clear. David and his companions ate the bread, which is lechem panim in the Torah, designated for the priests in Exodus 25. Nobody else is allowed to eat it. David actually breaks Torah, right? He actually does something really bad, but he has good reasons for it. So priests violate the Sabbath by doing their temple duties. And then something greater than a temple here. I want you to see the logic. The logic is 1 point, 2 point, 3 point. That's kind of like the argument. It's a 1, 2, 3 argument. If, then, therefore. Or, two cases, and then build out the conclusion. Now there's an additional tack on to this, and the additional logic that follows this 3-point argument is that God desires mercy, not sacrifice, and that the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. This is kind of like the maftir, right? By the way, in case you did not understand what my argument was, this is the big point I want to make. So if we look at it, what is the explanation of Yeshua's logic? Typically, people would say something like this. Something greater is here. Messiah is God, and he's the Lord of the Sabbath. So who are you going to argue with? Why are you even getting into this conversation? So the Pharisees need to back off because Jesus is greater than King David. Who's going to argue with that? Who also transgressed the most holy things. Read 1 Samuel 21. He did go and did break the Torah by eating the bread that he wasn't allowed to eat. But Messiah is king, greater than David, who's not subject to Torah. He can change the Torah if he wants to. He's the king. He's the king of kings, right? He's the big guy. So the disciples, of course, they're the ministers of God's kingdom. And just like the priests in the temple, they're not guilty of going about their duties, proclaiming the kingdom even on the Sabbath. Their mission supersedes the Sabbath. That is usually the typical commentary. Am I wrong? You guys read commentaries on this passage? Probably looked it up. I know I'm maybe simplifying it, but if you pull up a dozen of them, they're all going to say pretty much the same thing, up along those lines, maybe in different words. But this would be kind of the logic, okay? What I'm offering you is a completely different way of looking at this passage and analyzing it by using Jewish legal terminology. So in rabbinic hermeneutics, there is, in the interpretation, so to say, school, there are special midot. There are special ways you interpret the scripture. One of them, some commentators, some very enlightened writers, have noted that maybe, I think David Flusser was one of them, is that maybe Yeshua is using what we call Gezerah Shavah. Gezerah Shavah literally means similar ruling, which means this is like that. So I'm going to make a statement, I'm going to make a conclusion, but it's based on something else that you already know to be true. So I'm going to show you how this is like that. And based on that, I'm going to justify basically my conclusion. So David and his companions ate bread designated only for the priests. Can that be a Gezerah Shavah? Can that be a comparison that Yeshua is citing from the scriptures that's saying, hey, David did it, I can do it, or David did it, they can do it. Is that what he's doing? Some people basically kind of have that idea. Because David did it and he wasn't punished. If you remember the story, nothing came out of that story. There are things that David was punished for, but that one he wasn't punished for. So why is David's situation similar? Why would Yeshua quote this? Is David's situation even similar to his situation? So is this Gezerah Shavah? I don't know. I'm actually not convinced. But because to me the situation is not similar. I don't think that the situation is similar enough. Number one, it was not the Sabbath. There's no Sabbath context in David's situation. The disciples are not in danger of being captured and be dead, not like David and his men. David and his men are actually running for their lives. They're hungry, they're starving, they run into the temple to eat food. Because it's either they're going to get captured, because if they go to gather food from house to house or something, they get spotted, they're going to die. So there's a danger of life, and the stakes are really, really high with David, where it's not exactly the same here. The situation is not what I would call a solid comparison, not an exact analogy. So to me, it doesn't really rise to Gezerah Shavah. But I think the example was cited with David, not that David did something wrong, so we can do something wrong too. He was cited to bring the temple into the conversation about Shabbat. Because there's a very interesting rhetorical device that Yeshua is now going to use. He's going to use another kind of comparison. And why is that important? Why? Because the temple is the most holy thing. Everybody knows temple is top. This is it. So, yet David was not punished for violating the sanctity of the temple. That's the idea. So that brings me to another possibility. There's another logic called Kal V'Chomer, from lighter to heavier. That's another traditional way of exploring the text, okay? This is where you get, this is all over the Gospels. This is how much more argumentation. If this is true, then how much more is this true? So you've seen this many times, so I think that one is a lot easier to understand. So the priests violate the Sabbath by doing their temple duties. How much more can we do that, essentially? That's the idea. So if the temple is most holy, follow the logic, because of God's very presence. I mean, we know this is it. This is where Hashem is. So that's why we have so many rules about it. God gave us an inordinate amount of rules that have to do with the sanctity of the temple. Now, because of its importance, because of its servants, because of the sacrifices, the priests perform all types of work that the ordinary Israelites are not allowed to do. They're actually forbidden to do on the Shabbat, but the priests can. Why? The temple. The answer is what happens in the temple is way more important than Shabbat. That's the idea. So the priests are not considered transgressors of Torah, and why? Because the temple is greater than Shabbat. That's the logic. There's tiers of importance, tiers of hierarchy, essentially. And so what Yeshua is trying to get to is that the temple is holy, you know, Shabbat is holy, but the temple is over Shabbat, clearly by using the illustration of priests, because the priests get to do the things that are not allowed on Shabbat. Yet they're okay, and in the temple everything works. They're not breaking it. So I'll give you other examples. I mean, and there's a lot of examples like this. So the tithing produce, for example, is a commandment, right? So we know about that. Tithing on Shabbat is prohibited by Jewish law. Why? Because it disrupts the holiness of Shabbat. So you have two commandments. Tithing is a commandment. Shabbat is a commandment. Shabbat takes precedence, and tithing is of lesser importance. If you're asked to perform one commandment, which would now be in conflict with another commandment, what do? You do Shabbat. Shabbat supersedes the other commandment. But, following the same logic, you always follow for the greater mitzvah, which always supersedes the lesser one. So that means that there's a certain tiers of importance. There's certain gradations to the mitzvot. Certain commandments stand above other ones. And this is where Yeshua is leading us into, to help us understand where is temple, where is Shabbat, and where is something else. Where is something greater out there. That's exactly going to be his point. So, another interesting quotation here for you. If you guys know this one, you can stop me. Nedarim 3 in Mishnah. Rabbi Ishmael says, "Great is circumcision, since 13 covenants were made upon it." Rabbi Yossi said, "Great is circumcision, for it overwrites the Sabbath." Rabbi Joshua ben Kartha says, "Great is circumcision, for Moses' punishment for neglecting it was superseded even for 1 hour." Rabbi Nehemiah says, "Great is circumcision, since it overrides the laws of leprosy." Rabbi says, "Great is circumcision, for despite all the commandments which Abraham fulfilled, he was not designated complete until he circumcised himself. As it says, walk before me and be complete." Of course, that's the parsha we're reading today about Abraham's circumcision. So, guess what else supersedes Shabbat? Circumcision. The rabbis tell you flat out, we know that if a child needs to be circumcised on Shabbat, which you're not allowed, this is one of the 39 melachot you're not allowed to do. Cutting is not one of them. But this cutting is way more important than Shabbat. So guess what? On Shabbat, it's still going to be happening. So it supersedes. So there's a hierarchy. There are tiers of importance, and certain commandments are placed on top of other commandments. This is what Yeshua is trying to get us to with this whole discussion of the temple. So again, the same logic, kal v'chomer, from lighter to heavier. Something greater than the temple is here. That's the punchline. So I told you that the priests get to do this, but the priests are in the temple, so they get to essentially break Shabbat because of the temple. But I'm telling you, something even above the temple is also here. So, which would put that yet on another tier. What is that something greater? So, some people say that this is David's pressing need that he's using. There's hunger, there's danger. That allowed him to violate the most holy things in the temple. And so, if we know that the temple is so holy that even the Sabbath prohibitions can be set aside, then logically something can be even more important than the Sabbath. And that's maybe why David was not punished. So logically the Sabbath, which is even lesser status than ascending to the temple would be subordinate to such a thing. What is that thing? That's the question. So here's the verse. I tell you something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. For the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. So as I look at this passage, there are critical questions that come up in my mind. And the critical questions, and the interpretation of this entire passage will rest on how you answer these questions. Something greater refers to, fill in the blank, and the Son of Man refers to, fill in the blank. Depending on how you fill this blank, the interpretation of this passage will go. Here's the something greater for you. In English phrase, something greater, okay, is actually Greek word meson, which is a comparative adjective of neuter gender, which derives from another, megas. Megas means great, okay? That's a familiar word in English, mega this and mega that. Great, big, and that is a direct equivalent to the Hebrew word gadol, okay? So when I say something greater, I'm really saying something of a greater quality or something like that. But the key is that this is a neuter comparative adjective, and I know I'm transgressing the language borders right now because everything in other languages, not like English, is gender correlated, okay? So if you're multilingual, you totally understand me. Neuter adjectives usually describe a neuter object, okay? Words have genders. They have endings. That endings have meanings. And it's grammatical gender, don't confuse it with the biological gender. We're not talking about something, androgynous here, Why does the Greek text not say someone greater is here? If Yeshua is something great, someone greater, right? Then why didn't it say someone? The Greek text says something. Why does it use a neuter comparative adjective? Is it even proper to describe the Messiah with this? So here's the solution that I have for you. And it's right there in the text, but we have to see it and we have to know both languages to see it. Hosea 6:6 says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. The word in Hebrew is chesed there. Now the Greek term for mercy, which is a direct translation, is helios, which is a neuter gender noun. So if you're looking for a neuter object to be described by a neuter comparative adjective, it's right there in the text. The word helios, chesed, mercy, is neuter. Chesed in Hebrew, of course, not, but in Greek, it is. And when we're reading a Greek text and you have a Greek adjective, it has to go with the Greek noun, and that's the noun in there. So could it be that a neuter singular comparative adjective describes the only neuter singular noun in this passage? To me, that would be very logical. The problem is that this shifts the meaning of the passage from Messiah being greater to chesed, mercy, being greater. Do you see how that shifts the meaning? Yes. I told you, this is what's going to make this text go this way or that way. And either you say, oh, it doesn't matter, pay no attention to the gender, or you could say, no, the grammatical gender does matter. Two things we talked about. First is, what is something greater? What is that meson, right? The second is, what about the Son of Man? Because the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Well, that's actually is a lot easier to solve. So, what I want you to see is that Yeshua elevates mercy in other passages in his teaching as well. In fact, I believe that this may be the key of his Torah interpretation. In a lot of passages, as you notice, that mercy is kind of rises to the top. If that is truly the top priority, then a lot of it is going to be seen through that prism.